should be spending the whole time with Layla, as you heard from her. She's the one that really knows Iran, both from living there many years and from following everything that is in the news and from her many friends in Iran. What I have to say will be a little bit different, a little bit more about, maybe even a little more positive, I don't know. I've been involved with Iran since the summer of 1990. At that time, I was the Mennonite Central Committee Area Director for Middle East and South Asia. And there was a very bad earthquake in northwestern Iran that year, back in, I believe it was in June of 1990. And between 35,000 and 40,000 people died in that disaster. And at MCC, we decided we wanted to respond. We wanted to respond to that for one reason, it was such a terrible disaster. But we also wanted to show that we would respond to human need wherever it was, irrespective of religious and political differences. And so the first thing we were able to do through a contact that the NCC representative in Ottawa, Canada, made with an Iranian Canadian was to ship medical supplies over to Iran. And then we said we wanted to be involved somehow in the reconstruction after this. And we wanted to make a visit, send a delegation to visit Iran to see both the damage and see if there was any way that we could be involved. And I was not real confident that the Iranian embassy in Ottawa, Canada, which is where we communicated about this interest, that they would give us permission and visas to visit Iran. For one thing, we were basically an American organization. I thought that might be a problem. And also a Christian organization. And so I was somewhat surprised when our representative in Ottawa informed me that the embassy had said, yes, you can go, and when do you want to go? So a group of four of us, 2 Americans and 2 Canadians, visited Iran in January of 1991. And we toured the area that had been damaged by that terrible earthquake. And we decided that we would provide the funding for rebuilding 15 village, what they call health houses or village clinics. And on that visit, we learned to know the Iranian Red Crescent Society, which is within the Red Cross, Red Crescent group. And we worked with the Red Crescent Society for a number of years, providing assistance for disaster relief, refugee relief. After the first Persian Gulf War, there were a lot of Iraqi refugees in western Iran, and we provided materials that the Red Crescent Society could use in the camps that they had set up for them. We also provided some assistance with Afghan refugees, which were on the other side of the country. And it was really good working with the Iranian Red Crescent Society. It is a very large, very well organized organization, and it really had no need for the modest amounts of resources that NCC could provide. But the organization really seemed, well, they expressed that they really appreciated the collaboration with Mennonite Central Committee. And it meant both a lot to us as well, that's for sure. MCC, the way MCC ordinarily functions is that it sets up an office in a country, and it has volunteers from Canada and the US, and it also that work on various relief and development projects, also hires local staff. And we didn't feel like this was possible in Iran, and we didn't really try to do that, but we wanted to find a way to have some presence in Iran. And so the idea that we had was to have a student exchange program. During the Cold War, MCC used to send graduate students to study in Eastern European universities as a way of learning to know the people and the culture of those countries. And this seemed like a way that might work with Iran as well. And so we talked with the ambassador at the UN and some of his staff, and they liked the idea, and they said, give them a proposal. And so we did that, and they identified an institution in Qom, Iran. Qom is the center of Shiite Islamic education. And what we at MCC wanted the people that we sent to study in Iran, we wanted them to study Farsi language, we wanted to study Islam, study Persian literature, study Persian history. And I thought that anyone that Iran would send to the US, they would want to send engineering and science students. And we went over and we met with this institution that the government had identified that we could have this exchange relationship with. It was called the Imam Khomeini Education and Research Institute, a very conservative institution in Qom. And so we were able to send over a period of 13 years or so, 4 different couples that went over and lived in Qom and studied what I said they should study. I was surprised when my colleague in the mission here at the UN said Iran wanted to send their top philosophy and theology students to study philosophy of religion. And 2 families came to Toronto, and the men did PhDs in philosophy of religion at the Toronto School of Theology. And they were there for, I think one was there for 7 years and one was there for 10 years. And they're, interestingly, I think all their children now live either in the US or Canada. We also, when I was the director of the Center for Interfaith Engagement at Eastern Mennonite University, we wanted to have an Islamic professor there, as well as a Jewish professor. And so we advertised for that. And an Iranian scholar applied, and we ended up seeing him as the best candidate to be the Muslim scholar. It turned out his wife was also a scholar, and they came and they spent 3 years at Eastern Mennonite University teaching a variety of courses. And that was a good interaction. We've also, since then, well, beginning while I was with MCC and afterwards, we've organized a number of learning tours to Iran involving Canadian and Americans. One of them was an FOR one, which is when I first met Lila, and she asked me if I would be involved with leading that one. I'd like to tell you a little incident or kind of story about how that shows the interest that Iranians have in both peace study and peace building. At the Iranian mission to the UN back in the late 90s, there was a scholar and a diplomat, Dr. Sajjanpour, that I learned to know. And he told me he was very interested in the peace studies courses that American universities have. He said in Iran at that time, the universities there didn't teach peace studies. And so in the summer of 1999, I was on a several-month sabbatical from MCC, and I took what's called the Summer Peace Building Institute at Eastern Mennonite University. And I was able to get permission for Dr. Sajjanpour to visit while I was there. The Iranian diplomats at the UN are limited to a 25-mile radius of the UN without special permission from the US State Department. But we were able to get permission for, so he came and he was there, I think, 2 days and met the faculty of the Center for Justice and Peace Building and heard some lectures. And soon after that, he went back to Iran as the director of the Institute for Political and International Studies, which does research and policy development in the foreign ministry of Iran. And I told him if he would like to send one of his staff to attend the Summer Peace Building Institute, MCC would sponsor them. And so he sent a young man named Ali Akbar Razai in the summer of 2000. Interestingly enough, while Ali was at the Summer Peace Building Institute, his wife gave birth to their first child. And after the courses were over and he visited us in Akron, Pennsylvania, where the Mennonite Central Committee headquarters is, he saw on my computer his daughter and talked with his wife, I guess, about it. But anyway, some years later, I think it was 2006, there was a lot of tension between the US and Iran. And I contacted Dr. Sajjanpour, who at that time was the Iranian ambassador to the UN in Geneva, and asked him what he thought we could maybe do to prevent a war and promote peace between our countries. And he said, well, you've learned to know a lot of religious scholars in Iran. Why don't you get some Mennonite religious scholars and have them visit Iran and interact with Iranian religious scholars and talk about what can be done to prevent war. And so we were working at that, but the visas for that group weren't coming through. And so I was in contact with Dr. Sajjanpour, and he said, well, he had recently been from Geneva back to Tehran and had talked to Ali Akbar Razai, who could maybe help with the visas, and I should call him. So I called him. I was on a trip. I called him from Calcutta, India. And I don't remember what he said about the visas, but he said, the president's going to the US. And I thought he was talking about former President Khatami, because I knew he was coming, because I had been invited to a meeting at the National Cathedral where he was going to be speaking, but I was out of the country and I wouldn't be able to go to that. He said, no, President Ahmadinejad is going for the UN General Assembly in September, and could you arrange a meeting for him with American religious leaders? And I sort of gulped and said, yeah, we could work at that. And then, in fact, we were able to, and about, I think it was 47 religious leaders met with him when he was in New York for the General Assembly. And I asked Ali, why did you want us to do that? Arrange a meeting for the president with religious leaders here in the United States. Well, he said when he was at the Summer Peace Building Institute and had interacted with American religious leaders, it was such a good experience for him, and he wanted the president to also have that kind of experience. And these meetings with the president have gone on both several times with President Ahmadinejad and then President Raisi and the current president. Just one other thing. I'm now working with an organization called Luke 10, and there were 4 of us. Doug Hostetter, who some of you might know as a Mennonite peace activist, and 2 other people. One, Mehdi Farizadeh, who was cultural ambassador at the UN for Iran back in the early 2000s, and a Catholic lawyer who was very active in Democratic Party politics, and a good friend of Mehdi Farizadeh. The 4 of us wanted to do something. This was at the time of the pandemic, to help out Iran, both because it was very bad there and because the US sanctions against Iran made it difficult for Iran to get what they needed to respond to this pandemic. And we raised, I think, about $100,000, and we were able to channel that to Iran through an organization here that has an OFAC, or Office of Foreign Asset Control license, that allows them to support humanitarian work in Iran. Without that, it's illegal to do any spending of money for Iran. And so we provided that, and since then, Luke 10 has sponsored, I think, 10 interfaith webinars where Christian and Jewish scholars from North America, both the US and Canada, and Muslim scholars from Iran have an online interfaith dialogue. And one thing that Luke 10 did was, in collaboration with religious leaders both here and in Iran, we developed a statement called A Time for Peace, as we were very concerned that a war was about to break out. And this statement, which I'll read it, it's only one page, was signed by 6 Iranian Muslim religious leaders and scholars, and 14 American Christian, Jewish, and Islamic leaders. And we delivered it to both governments 2 days before the bombing started. So it was not effective in any way. But anyway, let me read this, and there are copies on the table in the back. A Time for Peace. Today, the human family is ensnared in armed conflicts that engender despair, anxiety, and the unending slaughter of innocents. We are a group of religious leaders from the United States and Iran with profound sympathy for all victims of war and oppression. We together implore our governmental leaders and those of other countries to take concrete steps towards reconciliation before even greater catastrophes befall us, which Leda described. Now is the time for religious leaders everywhere to take meaningful, constructive steps toward lasting peace and to extinguish the flames of enmity and hatred. Mutual trust must be forged between nations and faith communities, grounded in our sacred texts that call us to extend goodwill even in the hardest circumstances. Genuine peace means more than the cessation of hostilities. It entails cooperation across differences to address injustices, poverty and hunger, environmental degradation, and threats to public health. To realize true peace, which blesses all parties to conflict, religious leaders must call those wielding political power to oppose all aggression and tyranny, to acknowledge the rights of others, and to uphold universal human rights. Religious leaders with moral authority, sustained by their communities, must courageously stand for human dignity and nonviolent means of resolving conflicts. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is a cornerstone of our shared heritage and comes from God speaking directly to Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. If action to transform violent conflicts is not taken now, the horrors of war and devastation will spread and engulf thousands, if not millions, of innocent lives. We cannot allow that to happen. We stand ready to partner with governments, other faith communities, and civil society organizations to prepare the ground for genuine peace and cooperation, allowing hope to overcome cynicism and despair. And we pray that each concerted effort across national and communal borders will bear fruit so that our children and grandchildren can share an increasingly interdependent world in which all inhabitants flourish in lasting peace and security. And then the people who have signed it are named